Hello and welcome to my first video tutorial. In this tutorial I'll be showing you how to make the Chloe Leotard. So let's get started. First of all, you're going to want to cut out all of your pattern pieces, and if you are choosing to do lining, which I always do, you're also going to cut out your lining. Then you're going to start by basting your lining and your fabric together. I like to do this with a narrow and long zigzag stitch. I have pinned all of my pieces together first to make this process easier and to ensure nothing slips. Here's what it should look like, and I have removed all of my pins that were holding these in place. So now we are going to start the construction process. Here I am taking the bum piece at the side seam and I am placing it on top of the front piece at the side seam. We are going to stitch this side seam first. I like to do this with a short straight stitch, stretching slightly as you sew. Make sure that you back tack at the start and the ends and remove all of your loose threads as you go. Now we're going to move on to the shoulder, sewing it in the exact same way as you have sewn the side seam. Then you should have the shoulder seam attached and the short side seam done. Now we're going to move on to adding elastic around the back of the bum and the curve of the front. So starting at the open side of the brief, we are going to elasticate this with an 8mm elastic. The fabric is facing right side down and we are going to place the elastic on top. The width of the stitch that I am using is just narrower than the width of the elastic, and I'm using a length of about 4 out of 5 on my machine. You're going to gently pull the elastic as you sew, and that will slightly gather the elastic. Continue sewing this all the way along the open edge until you reach the other edge. This is what it should look like, with a slight amount of gathering along that edge that you have just elasticated. Now you're going to want to turn the elastic under to do the top stitching. This encases the elastic and creates that nice finished edge. Here I'm using a stitch width of 5, which is the maximum my machine does, and a stitch length of 4, which is the same that I used for the previous process. Be sure to back tack at each end and remove all loose threads as you go. This is what it should look like after it has been elasticated and top stitched. Now we're going to join the side seam that we had left open previously to the other side, the long side of your leotard. We are also going to join the front and back crotch seam as well. To sew this seam, we are going to use the same process as we did earlier, sewing with a short, straight stitch, slightly stretching the fabric as you go. Be sure to back tack at the beginning and the end. I'm going to repeat this process for the crotch seam. Now you may have noticed that I haven't been using any pins except for the first part when I'm basting and some other parts like the straps. For all of my seams I don't use pins anymore, and I've slowly just taught myself this skill over time. And at uni we were also encouraged not to use pins in our sewing. But please do use pins if this is how you like to sew or you feel most comfortable sewing. So now that we have our seams joined, we are going to go ahead and add the elastic in the leg holes. I'm going to be using 6mm elastic for the leg holes. Starting at the crotch seam, I'm going to open and flatten out that seam and place the elastic on the wrong side of the fabric. Laying it along the edge, we are going to stitch this elastic down. Again, we're going to be using a width that is just thinner than the piece of elastic we are using. Here I'm using a 3 out of 5 and a length of 4 out of 5. From the crotch seam to the side seam along the back of the bum, you are going to pull the elastic almost to 100% of its stretch. As you sew over the side seam, I like to flatten out that seam as I go. This creates a flatter and neater finish. So this is what the back part of the brief should look like once the elastic is added. And as you can see, it is quite gathered up. Then from the side seam, around the front of the crotch and down to the crotch seam, you're going to pull the elastic lightly so that there is a slight gather as you sew. As you reach the end where you started, you want to slightly overlap your elastic by about 1 cm and back tack. Then cut away the excess thread and elastic. And this is what the front of the brief should look like, with approximately this much stretch. So there's just a little bit of gathering there. And again, this is about how much stretch there should be at the back. And now I'm just going to go ahead and do the exact same thing on the other side, but in reverse. So only a little bit of stretch in the front and pull in the elastic at the back reasonably tight to create quite a fair amount of gathering. This is what it should look like, and now it's time to top stitch. So we're going to turn the leotard back in the right way and change our stitch width to about a 4 out of 5, so it just covers over the edge of the elastic as you sew. Just as we did before, we're going to top stitch just along the edge of the elastic, pulling the fabric flat as you go. It is also important to ensure that the elastic is pulled tight towards the edge of the fabric so that there's not any gathering happening around the edge of the leg hole. This causes unsightly pleats and gathers in the fabric, and we really don't want any excess in this area. Be sure to back tack at the end, going over the top of where you started by about 1 centimetre. Now we're going to repeat this exact same process on the other side for the other leg hole. Folding under the elastic, we are going to zigzag stitch all the way around the edge of this leg hole as well. And now you should have 2 elasticated leg holes. I'm now going to show the exact same process with a different angle so that you can see what I'm doing a little bit closer up. Feel free to skip ahead to 8 minutes 30 if you want to continue on with the video. Alright, time to move on to the top of the neck hole that goes around to the shoulder at the back. The edge of the back piece, with the right side facing down, we are going to start adding elastic here. I'm using 8mm elastic for this, but you can also use 6 or 12. This process is very similar to elasticating the front part of a leg hole. You're only stretching the elastic slightly as you go, so there's a little bit of gathering behind the stitching. Following the curve around the back of the shoulder can be a little bit tricky as the fabric sometimes likes to slip, so take your time and go slow here. And if the elastic does come off the fabric here, that's okay. Just stop where you are and unpick back to where the elastic started going off of the fabric, and then start again. And as always, when I'm going over the shoulder seam, I like to make sure that it is sitting flat. This creates less bulk in the seam when you turn it under to top stitch. Now we're going to go ahead and trim our threads and then top stitch what we have just sewn. We're going to fold the elastic under once and we are going to top stitch. Here I'm using a 4 or a 5 width, and my machine goes up to 5, so that is the maximum width that I have on my machine. Once again, make sure when you're going over the shoulder that the seam is sitting flat underneath. Alright, now we're going to use a 6mm elastic to go down the open side of the leotard. So turn the leotard back inside out, and we are going to start stitching at the top of the leotard, which is where the underarm is. My machine is set to a width of about 3, which is just thinner than the width of the elastic. And we are only pulling slightly on the elastic so it creates a slight gather, the same way that we elasticated the neck hole. When you reach the bottom, you're going to go over the seam that you've created between the back of the brief and the front of the leotard. So you're going to sew about 2 centimeters of elastic down past the line where the brief ends. The purpose of this is just to stabilize this area and provide some extra support in this seam join. Now we just need to top stitch this seam. So we're going to trim all of our threads and turn the costume back in the right way. And starting at the bottom where we just finished the last piece of elastic, we're going to top stitch. You want to start sewing a couple of millimeters below the end of the piece of elastic, and then top stitch all the way up to the armhole, and make sure you back tack quite a bit there because that is a high stress point. And just to reiterate, we have top stitched all the way down past the end of the elastic by a few millimeters, and this just makes sure that everything is encased nicely and has a bit of extra strength and support. So now we need to join the back of the shoulder to the underarm of the front. Grabbing that piece, we're just going to lay it on top, and we're going to start at the underarm and work our way down. As you can see here, I have just pinned it there to make sure that it sits right where I want it to. I also like to top stitch this seam towards the front of the leotard. This just holds everything in place nicely, but this is an optional step. So next we are going to elasticate this armhole seam, and this is the last one we have to do. Starting at the shoulder, making sure it is all laying flat, put it underneath your presser foot, and we're going to use a 6mm elastic here. For this area, you only want to use a little bit of tension on your elastic so it creates a slight gather. Be sure to overlap the ends of your elastic by about 1 centimeter, and then it is time to top stitch. Turning it back in the right way and folding the elastic under one time, placing it under your presser foot and using a width of about 4, we are going to top stitch all the way around this arm seam. I like to start at the shoulder because I find this is the easiest area to start. Alright, now you should have a finished leotard and it's time to do the straps. To make the straps, I cut strips of lycra that are the width of this ruler, and I bought this ruler from Officeworks. It's about 4 centimeters wide for your reference. Now we're going to be sewing on elastic along the right side of the piece of lycra. And for this, you're going to be using 12mm wide elastic. However, you can use 6 or 8mm, but I think 12mm works the best. Place your piece of elastic along the right edge of your piece of lycra, and I have my machine settings set at the longest length that you have, -5, and a width of about 3. You just want it to be inside the width of the elastic. Now you're going to sew all the way down the strip of lycra with a slight amount of tension on the elastic so it creates a little bit of gathering behind you as you sew. As you can see here, I'm sewing slightly off the right hand side of the piece of lycra, but you don't have to. You can sew right on the edge if you prefer. It just makes it a little bit easier in the next steps where you need to turn the elastic over itself. So as you can see here, there's just a little bit of rippling happening at the back from the gathering. And that's exactly what you want. Not too much and not too little stretch here. I'm just going to go ahead and quickly finish the rest of this strip, and then we'll move on to the next step. So coming all the way back up to the top where you started, this is where we're now going to turn the elastic under. So we're going to turn it once on top of itself, and then we're going to turn it a second time, and this will form your strap. So now we're just going to top stitch this. Here we go, I'll show you again, just turning it over once, and then twice, and you're pulling it tight as you do so there's no loose gapey bits. I like to use the machine's settings of a width of 5, which is the widest I can go, which almost covers the entire piece of elastic, and a length of 4. As you sew, you're going to be turning the elastic under itself once and twice, like I just showed you, and you're going to pull the elastic so that the lycra is sitting flat as you're sewing your top stitching. There's not a lot of tension on the elastic, it's just enough so that there's no rippling in the lycra. You also want to make sure that you're pulling that piece of excess to the left as far as it can go so that you get a nice tight strap. I'm going to go ahead and speed this up, but you're just going to continue to sew until you reach the bottom. And then it's time to cut away the excess fabric. So, grabbing it at the end that you just finished at, can you see this little flap of fabric that we were using just before to turn it under with? We're now going to cut that piece off. So sliding your scissors in between where you've just stitched and that flap, you're going to go ahead and trim away that excess fabric all the way up your strap. So this is what the back of the strap will look like, and this is the front, the right side. And if you have any of these little pieces here, you can just trim them away. And this is the final result. These are the straps that I use on all of my costumes. So now, let's go ahead and attach this to our costume. This is a personal preference and you can arrange straps in any way that you want. Start by putting your costume on a mannequin, or if you want to, you can put it on your child to measure the straps. And now, it's just a matter of pinning the straps where you want them to go. Some things you need to consider is that this design is not wearable without straps, so you will need to add straps to at least the underarm and connecting to the back to hold it up. I would also recommend adding a few additional straps, especially one that connects from the side to near the other side at that underarm point that you can see here. I also find that many dancers want a strap in the front regardless of how high I make the top of the neckline. So it is important to add some there because their comfort is the most important thing. And finally, the last consideration would be, can this get on and off? If it can't get on and off easily, kids will often complain. So make sure that you put clasps in where you need to, so it goes over their head or over their hips. Those are the two largest areas to consider. Now we just need to sew these straps in place. I'm using a zigzag stitch with a width of 4 and a length of 4. I like to go back and forth over these areas a few times, like 2 or 3, because these areas are such high wear and tear, it's good to have that extra reinforcement in there. Now just keep going until all your straps are attached. Be careful not to stitch over your pins because this can break your needle. And finally, when you're attaching the clasps, I like to do this with a straight stitch, with a very short length of about 2. I like to start by putting my needle down into the middle of the piece of elastic and stitching back and forth a few times to make sure it's very secure. And that's it, you're done! Happy sewing and dazzling! If you have any questions, drop them in the comments.